So thank you very much, James, and thanks to the Sussex Humanities Lab for inviting me here to speak in the first place. I've been asked to share some of my thoughts on something that has become really fundamental and frustrating and a cherished part of my research, and that's scale. Now, I'm a historian of the late 18th and early 19th century Anglophone newspaper periodical press. And that's quite a mouthful. When I began, it was a bit simpler. During my postgraduate days, I was a historian of the Scottish borders. Nice, simple, direct. And as I moved on, I could add a bit of a proviso to that. I was a historian of the late Georgian Scottish borders, adding a bit of a contraction to the chronological scale of an already somewhat niche field of the Scottish borders. But as time marched on, as my aspiration grew, I started to go across Britain and across the British Empire and then across the Anglophone world. And I could no longer speak of late Georgian history because that would annoy my American colleagues. And I couldn't be really very specific about geography anymore. So my elevator pitch of my research became much more complicated. And truth be told, I quite like it that way. The world is a complicated place. And wherever we look, there is beauty and there is wonder around. Now, not all of our history is beautiful. Much of it is dark and heart-rending and cruel. And some of it is hopeful, joyous, and inspiring. The rest does not fall somewhere in between. Human history and the representations that we make of it cannot be placed on a simple spectrum of good and evil, of important and banal. For all of our faults and foibles, for our tendency to repeat our mistakes and chase past glories, and all of our predictably horrible and kind treatment of each other, we have always, as a species, in the same breath, struggled to defy, destroy, and outmaneuver any classification or constraint we place on who we are or what our actions can be defined as. So, in the words of every single historian I have ever met, when trying to understand our collective brutal and beautiful past, the best we can really hope for is, it depends. So, as we seemingly depart from the comfortable gradation of the analog world and move to the harsh realities, the harsh binaries of the digital world, we have to ask a very simple question. Can "it depends" survive? And as I am a historian, I expect you can guess my answer. Now, there are manifold ways that the ambiguities and subjectivities of the human experience can be expressed in a digital world. And one of the most important ways we can do this is through our manipulation of scale. Now, long before the advent of the digital, we have struggled with the idea of scale. The case study, the lives and times of a single man, is a tempting siren song that we tend to deride as unrepresentative and anecdotal. This tension existed long before the digital, and the digital will neither solve nor entrench it further. It does, however, offer us an interesting new way to approach our research. To look at our questions at the large, the medium, and the small scale, and most importantly, to stitch them back together in a way that might, hopefully, appease even the most "it depends"-like historian. So I begin with an orchard. Now, like an orchard, there is an intrinsic beauty in the large scale. Sweeping lines and bold contrasts of color, heat maps and network diagrams give us a sense of the wider picture, the whole to which the individual human experiences can belong. But how do we approach the large scale of human history? Now, traditionally, we have used words like sweeping and broad. The sweeping narrative of the US, or a broad account of medieval Europe. Scale was bound up with topic, with scope. In the digital humanities, however, scale can almost, and I do say almost, be analogous to depth. In the digital humanities, it doesn't necessarily mean the topic, although it can, but scale can also refer to the quantitative weight of evidence that must be processed in order to reach our conclusions, the number of individual records that we must examine. So whether this means examining hundreds of thousands of individual records at the large scale, or analyzing a single source to the finest conceivable detail, the digital humanities has become, much like politics, the art of the possible. So now, on a large scale, my research into reprint culture was not possible 15 years ago. On the one hand, scissors and paste journalism, the process by which one newspaper copied a bit or a whole from another newspaper, was very well known to historians of the periodical press. It was also very well known to people at the time. In fact, it was so well known that it became a common joke between newspaper editors and their readers. Delayed editions were often excused to their readers, saying they had misplaced their scissors or their pot of paste. On the other hand, to really understand the mechanics of scissors and paste journalism, to understand the scale of reprinting within 19th century newspapers, required a cataloging system that went far beyond the remit of any sane historian, group of historians, or multi-generational institute of historians. Now, fortunately, the late 18th and early 19th century compositors of these newspapers seem to have been, shall we say, greatly overworked. Their plagiarism, if it's fair to call it plagiarism in this context, was of the most direct and machine-readable kind. And over the past 10 years, the development of text mining and anti-plagiarism software, alongside the mass digitization of OCR transcripts of these newspapers, has provided us a means of understanding the large scale of reprinting in the 19th century press. So my research looks very closely at how we can detect reprinting, not in a single case, maybe with an attribution or just where our historian's eye finds it, but how we can discover plagiarism on the large scale. Now, as James mentioned sort of mysteriously at the beginning, I tend to use software for purposes it was never intended to be used. And one thing that really struck me was the idea that if I'm looking for reprinting, direct reprinting, absurdly direct reprinting, the best place to look for that was with plagiarism detection software. So while I began my work with Turnitin and various other commercial providers, that quickly became not a feasible option for the number of primary sources I wanted to use, and also because I think Turnitin would have got quite cross with me if I filled their entire database with 18th and 19th century newspapers. So instead I use a program called CopyFind, which was developed by a physicist in Virginia for the simple purpose of having a standalone plagiarism detection. And the way it worked was really quite simple. Take a corpus of works, stick it into the program, and it would find matches. And the reason I really loved this program was because it let me do something at a large scale that wasn't really possible with other tools. Now, I've used Voyant tools and Juxta to see addition tracking before, how one text changes to another. But it wasn't really wonderful for scale. It was good for 2 or 3 documents to look at the changes between them. But that's only if you knew what those documents were, and I wanted to look at an entire corpus. In this case, the 19th century newspaper collection of the British Library. The other problem was that the British Library's 19th century newspaper collection was transcribed by optical character recognition, which at best is fuzzy, shall we say. And this program was really wonderful. As you can see here, the red text, the non-italicized text, are those bits that match identically. The OCR worked, essentially, and you can find 2 newspapers that have the same text. The blue, however, are words that are close. A couple characters are wrong. There may be a stray number or punctuation mark. And what I found really wonderfully about this is that this was a much more effective way of finding reprints than going through manually with every single set of 3 or 4 words I could think of in the normal search engine box that the library provided. This found matches I never was able to find with my most creative keyword creation ways. So once you run this through the British Library collection, and there is a process before you can run it, of course, the back-end data being in XML structured data, and not the most user-friendly XML data, I will have to say. 80% of any good project is cleaning the data before you begin. But once the data is clean and you run it through plagiarism detection, you get a sense of how many matches there are. And this is the next level of the plagiarism detection software. It gives both text. In this case, I had every single page of every single newspaper as its own text. And it gives you a side-by-side comparison, which you just saw a moment ago. You also get lots of nice statistics, the left matching, the right matching, and the overall perfect match of the text. And all this data can be very useful at different scales. But what this gives you in sort of a raw sense is a general overview of what the network of reprinting looked like. Where do these matches lie? Now, there is noise in the database. There are false matches, false positives, and false negatives. The most annoying of which are advertisements, which even if they're not identical advertisements, the formulaic nature of advertisements means they pop up all over the time. But we can work on that later. For the moment, we have this raw data of reprints, likely reprints, in 100 years of newspapers that have been digitized by the British Library. And what you get are visualizations. Well, after you run it through Gephi anyways, you get visualizations. Now, I am going to be very careful here in preferences. These are not necessarily statistically sound social network diagrams. There are a lot of ifs and buts to this data. Most importantly, which newspapers were digitized within this collection. So it doesn't give me a perfect idea of the network of information in 19th century Britain. There are lots of newspapers missing, and there are lots of articles that simply didn't get scanned properly. However, if you look at these two different data, this is from 1810, and this is from 1817, before and after the Napoleonic Wars. And because it is showing broad lines, and the darker and fatter these lines are, the more matches existed between those two newspapers in a given year, you can see something quite important. At large scale, even though we don't know the direct relationship between the Exeter Flying Post and the Derby Mercury, we can tell that in this period, in 1810, there's a wide community of shared knowledge. The shared information is going through many, many more newspapers than it is in 1817. There's a much tighter community here with more outliers in this period. And that makes perfect sense considering the Napoleonic Wars are going on here. There's going to be a lot more shared content than after the conflict has ended. So in the end, there is a beauty to large-scale analysis. You get a clear idea of interesting questions you can ask. However time-consuming the initial cleaning of the data may have been to do large-scale analysis, and it was time-consuming, there is a beauty in the final result. Input every scrap of evidence that we have into the magical computation machine, and answers like Athena burst forth, fully formed, ready to consume. Said no digital humanist ever, but it does give you a place to start. It gives you no permanent answers to your questions, but the sound and fury of large-scale analysis, while not signifying nothing, can usually give interesting questions, even if it cannot give satisfying answers. So now we move down to the medium scale, what I have referred to as the barren borderlands of the middle. So our digital toolbox is not simply for the large scale. Digital humanities should not, cannot, will not mean big data. They are different things, as I'm sure most of you will know. And the medium scale has its own mysteries to unravel. Now, in the English language, the middle ground has a bit of a bad reputation. It always seems somewhat compromised. It's neither as bold as the large scale nor as subtle as the small scale. It is in many ways the awkward middle child of historical research, a half-hearted attempt to make our case studies more applicable and relevant, and our sweeping narratives less overwhelming, generalized, and contentious. In periodical studies, this has often been achieved through something called soundings and samplings, a collection of case studies bound together for a common purpose. Its conclusions are constrained, however, by the organic and unclear methodologies of samplings and soundings. But it is wholly unfair to refer to the middle scale in this way, a scale that is important and invaluable in its own right. So take, for example, the issue of directionality. When we looked at the wider network graph of newspaper reprintings, we see a sea of connections, bringing together different periodicals through a shared knowledge of common experience. But it doesn't really tell us how those connections work. What directs them? Who follows? Who is the midwife or the gatekeeper of a particular piece of information? Who moves this information from region to region and place to place? And that's when we can take our large-scale analysis and look at it in a different way. Now, once I had my matches, once I had that idea of who was copying from who, I had to decide how to make it a directed social network graph. How do I put arrows instead of bold lines? And this is where the middle ground really comes to the fore. You have the data you've collected from the large scale, but the heuristics you use to understand it come from the small scale. By looking at those case studies, by understanding the true mechanics, you can apply digital heuristics to your data to give a middle ground. So what I've done in summary to this data is I applied 3 simple rules after much consternation to my data. First, anything that was more than 200 days apart, I ignored. This was usually advertisements or circulars. It wasn't news content being copied from place to place. I also removed anything that was considered too small a match. Now, I could have done that at the first level, just made my OCR plagiarism detection software a little bit less subtle, but I wanted to get the biggest amount of data as possible. And one thing that was really important to me is I did it at page level. I didn't do it at article level. So I could find something where you had 3 or 4 articles that were printed in the same newspaper. So obviously they were taking all of it from one individual newspaper and taking all 3 articles and putting it in a new one. And even though the articles themselves were quite tiny, it gave me a good idea of what their actual connection was. Now, the third rule I had was basically about date and size. So to match these 2 articles together, I found the oldest original that matched it of all the originals that had the same matching score. So if 2 articles were 700 characters alike, I would take the oldest version of that. It most likely took it from the older newspaper. If they were the same day, they obviously didn't copy from each other. Even the best compositors aren't quite that quick to do it. So in the end, I ended up with this simple chart, and this was done with a very simple C++ program that I wrote. And once you have this, that sea of connections takes on a very different character. And suddenly you have an idea of just how the information is flowing through this network. Now, as you can see here, the Morning Chronicle has a rather disproportionate influence on the newspapers that have been digitized by the British Library. And the strongest connection is with the Caledonian Mercury. And if you look at the inverse of this graph to see where the Caledonian Mercury is getting all of its information, it's pretty much the Morning Chronicle. It tends to like what the Morning Chronicle has to say. Now, of course, there are issues with this data as well. This only gives us an idea of within the reprinted content. So although this is a gigantic arrow, it doesn't actually represent all of the Caledonian Mercury's content. It's just, if it stole it from somewhere, it stole it from the Morning Chronicle. And I consider this to really be a medium scale examination of the data because it is narrowing down on a particular question. How does the data move, and how does this particular aspect of the large scale data actually look upon closer examination? Thus, for me, the middle is not an awkward downscaling of a large or an upscaling of a small scale study. It's an opportunity to combine methodologies in new and unexpected ways. More importantly, I think it's a way to stretch ourselves as historians. Now, the scientific method is all about reproducibility. Histography is not about reproducibility. But perhaps it should be. However subjective human experience might be, and however subjective our interpretation of that experience may be, the ability to communicate that interpretation, to show another person, this is why I think this is the case, can hardly be objectionable to a humanities scholar. So wandering around the middle scale, I must ask myself, can I teach a computer to have a historian's gut instinct? By which, of course, I mean, do I, as a historian, know what my gut is doing? If I decide to include or not include a particular heuristic to my data, is there a good reason for that? And I have to understand them before I can teach them to the computer. And now to the parochial pariah of the small scale. This all leads us to our often neglected friend, the case study. Now, when I began, I referred to the case study as a derided siren. And I think this is probably the best way I can describe it, because article after article, book after book, paper after paper, I see it. The historian who desperately wants to be a biographer, who has fallen madly in love with their subject, the ins and outs of their strange and circuitous life, but who is honor-bound by the norms of academic precedent to strive for a larger scale, the representative, the meaningful. Small-scale case studies are anecdotal. They're not representative, and that is why I like case studies. I like them because they give me a chance to see clearly what is a correlation and what is coincidence. On the one hand, however, you may not think the digital has much to do with a case study. What is the value of letting loose our colossal thinking machines upon a single text, a single life? Surely these types of studies are best left to our historians' brains, with their reserve of experience and their organic connections. Our analog neural networks are able to accept and communicate nuance and subjectivity. Perhaps, but then again, perhaps shifting out of this perspective ever so slightly might do historical research a world of good. One way to make our brains look at a particular document in a slightly different way is to let a computer look at a document with all of its flaws and preconceptions. So for the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to be speaking about a series of articles about cannibals attacking a British ship. And when I read this article about cannibals attacking a British ship, I was struck by several things. The language used, the way the story had been narrated, the principal players as the narrative played out. But I wanted to be able to see if my interpretation was colored by the words I chose to focus on, the bits of the story I had resonances with and therefore focused upon. So I used something called the Regressive Imagery Dictionary. And what I used here is a particular website called 750 Words. And if you enter text into 750words.com, you receive a visual representation of the feeling of the text you have given. Now, if you look at this, it's a very large report. This is only a small sample. You can see that it has a PG-13 rating, a US rating of PG-13, a 12, I suppose, in UK standards. And that's pretty low, considering the grisly nature of being eaten by cannibals, but maybe they had enough of a temperate vocabulary that they got it under PG-13. The most prominent feelings are upset and death. Of course, that makes sense. But there are these other feelings as well, feelings of self-importance, feelings of affection. There's also the idea of success and religion. And to be fair, I did not notice the religious element in the article at all the first time I read it. I said, that's a pretty big wedge. I wonder why it's picked up on that. And I went back and I looked through the text again, and I noticed there were mentions of missionaries. There were mentions about the religious aspects to the cannibalism that I had not seen. So while it's not the most important part of the article, I wouldn't write an entire book on the religious aspects of cannibalism from it. It did give me a different perspective. So the digital tool on the small scale gave me something new to look at. But how does this relate to the medium and the large scale that I spoke of before? Well, I wanted to understand how the greater forces at work, those connections and especially that directionality, was really playing out at the small scale. At the medium scale, I used a rather crude metric, chronology and raw character difference. But what could I understand if I looked very specifically at the changes made? So taking a page out of the book of phylogeneticists and evolutionary biology, I decided to take every word, every piece of punctuation in every variant of this article and make it a binary. So this is one headline. It only appears in the London St. James Chronicle, but the British vessel plundered by the natives of the Marquesa Islands. And it has all those words, so it has ones. All of these other versions have different headlines, so there's zeros here. And by treating every word, and especially every punctuation mark, because there's some passive-aggressive editing going on between these newspapers, I could map out just how similar or different all the variants were. And in the end, you end up with this, a dendrogram, an evolutionary branching and clustering of different texts. And it's a little bit difficult to see here, but the Sydney Gazette, which is the original version of the article, and it branches off into the London Star, which is sort of on its own. It's its own variant of how the article came about. And here you can see that the London Courier and the Morning Chronicle are very similar in nature, slightly removed from the London Star, the first British version, and quite removed from the Sydney Gazette that originated it. London St. James Chronicle is all on its own, mostly because it tended to add a lot of commentary. And the London Times and the Aberdeen Journal over on your right. Now, this is not a chronological branching. In fact, if you look at how the chronology works out, it's quite clear that the Aberdeen Journal probably copied from the London Courier. But what it gave me a perspective on is that the end result, the overall words that were used, were most similar between two articles I knew hadn't been copied from each other. They had gone down different evolutionary pathways, but ended up with a very similar result. So now I have all these interesting questions. Are these editors very similar? Do they conceive of their audiences as being very similar? What does the way they chose to make these edits say about the pathways they eventually took? Now, all of this leads me to the question of time. Can a historian really be expected to undertake this sort of multi-level analysis of every project they undertake? The answer is probably no. But that doesn't mean that multi-level analysis should not occur. Now, for several years, I presented my initial findings several years ago, I presented my initial findings at the Digital Humanities Congress in Sheffield. And at the conclusion, one listener noted, I think affectionately, that she thought it was great that I could undertake this sort of boutique digital research. It was kindly meant. And although I didn't think so at the time, I've really become to love the idea of boutique big data. My own work in the field has been somewhat chaotic, butterfly-like, we'll say, flitting from one method to another, one software tool to another, just to try to figure out what exactly is possible with the newspaper data we have. And I've loved every moment of it. But it's not without a tinge of regret that I look upon my various databases and I see so much potential left unexplored. And it's with this potential in mind that I began my scissors and paste repository. Now, rather than simply transcribe my articles or transform the XML databases, I tried to encode them with Text Encoding Initiative P5 standards. And when I did this, after much experimentation to get the vocabulary correct for what I wanted to do, I ended up with a database that had lots of extra information in it besides the raw transcriptions that had previously been on my hard drive, the giant file of plain text transcriptions I had once been content with. And this information about where the publication had taken place, what locations were mentioned, the individuals that were there, I don't need it for my research. My research is on reprint culture. I just need the raw transcriptions. But because it's there, and because I've made it available through GitHub, through a branchable and upgradable version, other people can use it for entirely different ways. So even if I abandon my search at the large scale or the medium scale, making that data available allows people to upscale it, downscale it, or continue at the same scale with new and interesting questions in new and interesting avenues. And it's for that same reason that I recently transformed the database into RDF standards. Now this was particularly challenging. There wasn't a standard vocabulary for what I wanted to do. And for those of you who are not familiar with RDF, it is the format for linked data, a way of connecting different parts of the semantic web of machine-readable information with each other. And what I wanted to do was to link my newspaper transcriptions with different versions of it. So the actual hard copy catalog record in the British Library, the digital image on British Newspaper Archive. And this was a bit of a cheat because I was actually using the British Library version, but they didn't have static URLs, so I had to use the pay URLs instead. Linking it to the Library of Congress subject headings for keywords, using my historical gut for what topic the newspaper article fell in, and geonames to connect it to geographical locations. Now, in the end, this database was really useful for me when I asked a couple of separate questions to my research, but I hope it will be more useful to others and that people will be able to link to it and help it grow. Maybe in another life, maybe in another database I never even see, but in a way that allows boutique research with this big data or big database that I've been using. So GitHub is one location to share your data. It's the one that I use because I'm a bit of an exhibitionist when it comes to my research, and I don't mind sharing all the terrible spelling errors I make when I transcribe, as it gives a version history of every time I upload my database. But there are lots of other ways people share their data. People share it through Figshare. People share it just on their own websites, and that's fine as well. The idea is that the more we share of our small scale or our big scale projects, the more those other scales can be developed in a collaborative way, even if you never meet the people with whom you're collaborating. So I would like to conclude with the simple thought that when you think about scale, when you think about where your research fits into the wider world or how the wider world fits into your research, I would ask that you think on the words of Vincent van Gogh. Great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. Thank you very much.
I guess I'd probably share it.
You talked about making your data available for others to take and do stuff with. Do you think that sort of scales, is one way of putting it, for people to sort of find it via serendipity, or is it only people who kind of know what they're looking for who are going to find your data?
Well,
is that the most efficient way of getting more people to use it?
I don't know if it's the most efficient way. It is the best I could do with my particular resources, but it has been found by other people and it has been used by other people. And the idea is that I'm not precious about when people link back to me. So if people download my database and do all sorts of things to it, add to it, I'd like them to share it as well so that I can see what they've done. But at the same time, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing to me is if I make a giant database of all the possible matches in the 19th century British Library newspaper collection, I can never go through all of them. I don't have the time. But someone else might be the focus of their whole project, and that's only advancing our knowledge. So my end goal would be that someday there is a repository for historical data that everyone goes to. In the meantime, I try to make it as linkable as humanly possible and tell as many people about it as possible.
Isn't it evil of you to treat literature as data? Creating this stuff?
Treating the newspaper articles as data?
Yeah.
No. I think what I was hoping for is that looking at things at different scales would allow you to look at it as data and as literature. And that what I'd hoped to show with my imagery dictionary idea is that treating it as data can help me appreciate it as literature in a different way. I would look for things I might not have in the first place. As to the linked data version of it, where I was trying to quantify individual people, places, and concepts, we do that all the time anyways. And if you make those available, those biases and assumptions, those things that are in the back of your mind when you're writing your journal articles, if you make that explicit, it sort of helps people understand where you're coming from and why you made the interpretation you did. There's nothing more frustrating for me than when I read an article and it's eloquently written, and it seems to have this beautiful interpretation of the text, and all I want to do is grab the historian by the shoulders and say, how do you know that? Where did you get that conclusion from? Because I can't see the annotations they've made on that primary source. So I think we always treat literature as data, but we just don't always share our how we've codified it.
In a way, you're treating the data as literature in a way, right? You've got a correlation, you haven't got... You said something like, what is a correlation, what is coincidence?
Yeah.
And in the linguistics session with Seth, he was talking about the difference between what is a co-occurrence between words and what is chance?
Yeah.
And there seems to me to be this thing with the digital humanities that bringing in a digital tool is a way for us to elevate out of chance and coincidence, which seems to me to be like connected to interpretation and it's your gut, and to transform literature into a type of data that can produce a correlation that is empirical. Do you know what I mean? So I guess you talked a lot about your gut, and you talked a lot about data and correlations, and you talk a bit about how and in fact James introduced you by talking about the creative ways in which you're using these tools. So I guess I'm interested in these sort of, they're not binaries, right? They're coming together. We've got data and literature, we've got correlation, and we've got the gut. I'm just interested in how you think about the work that you're doing in terms of being like to do with data and or literature, to believe like this digitization of your gut or your gut entering into a database. You know, how, if you're seeing these as like opposites, as binaries, or as like two sides of the same process that's coming in, and in a kind of way, in sort of a sort of obsessively offhand way, it's sort of like the digital versus humanities, right? On the one hand, and not in my opinion, or I guess anyone in this room, right? But to some critics of what this is, you know, on the one hand you've got digital data and like, you know, solid empirical facts. On the other hand you've got like humanities who are like, what's the nice word of saying that? That's what I was going to say. But who are like messing around in their offices with their like guts and their instincts and their intuitions, and like grab them and make them give you facts, right? And then you have the side, you know. So I think a lot of what is cool about what we're doing is about talking about how they all piece together and merge into like different apparatuses and different practices. And it seems to me that the way you're talking about it, the way James is introducing you, is as a practitioner of sort of merging of these things. And so I wondered if that made any sense, or if you could talk about it.
It absolutely does.
How you consider yourself as a scholar and like what?
So I think it's really interesting when you talk about the digital humanities to people who aren't necessarily in the digital humanities. There's a lot of confusion, fear, mistrust, hatred, and then sometimes it's like, oh, well, that's what you're doing in the other room. I think what it all kind of bangs down to is what you said a minute ago with the idea of the scientific method and data on one side and the humanities way over here in their ivory towers reading books and thinking deep thoughts. And that's a really new idea of the humanities, and I think people tend to forget that the idea of natural philosophy, of moral philosophy, of political economy, they were all about rigorous, rational thought about the humanities, and we've lost a lot of that in a sort of postmodernist world where it's been internal in a lot of respects, and what my subjective interpretation is doesn't have to be rational in that sort of Aristotelian way. So when I think of the digital humanities, I think it's forcing me to remember my sort of rationalist moral philosophy roots, and that there used to be a time when history was not science, but where the sciences were actually taking quite a lot from the humanities and the idea of logic. So I think it's sort of returning to our roots in a lot of ways, and there is interpretation. And the reason I think there's interpretation is not necessarily our methods. Our methods can be as rigorous and as sound, they're not now, but they could be, as rigorous and sound as any physical science. The problem with history is you can't experiment in the same way. I cannot go back to 1547 and do an interview or a Gallup poll of people's opinions. So there's always incomplete data. So we're doing the best we can with the data we have. And I think that is where the art and the interpretation of the humanities really flourishes and should be valued. But I think there is more than enough room for that sort of digital humanities thinking, even if you don't use digital tools. If I have a friend who doesn't use computers at all, hates computers, but she can explain to me her methodology and her assumptions and the points that she's trying to make the way you would have to do it to a computer, a very step-by-step exact way, I think that would make her research better because I would understand her interpretation at a much deeper level than if I just kind of got the end result and the narrative. I don't know if that answers all of your points, but...
It does.
When you're talking about the large scale,
Yes.
You talked about it as an exploratory tool, indicative, I think you said a place to start. So my question would be, can it be an end in itself?
Yes. I think for my particular research, I started at the small scale. The first article I ever wrote on my cannibals, I basically noticed, going through hard copy newspapers, that this article had been repeated. And then as my research continued, I was able to use digital tools to sort of do it at a larger scale, to sort of see why this case study interested me. You know, was it replicable on a large scale? But I think it's sort of a sine wave. It goes back and forth. So I don't think that either the small scale, the medium scale, or the large scale should be the endpoint. I think it constantly needs to go back and forth. In my particular question I was asking there, how do reprint networks work? It was a starting point for me. But I think if I'm going to be rigorous, it should go back and forth. And at any particular point in the publication cycle, the large scale will definitely be the endpoint because it'll answer or it'll illustrate a specific conclusion. So, that's it.
Yeah, no, the idea of changing scale.
Just very interested in how you're presenting the results in calculus and things. Are you doing sort of article with static graphs, network graphs, or are you going to do the interactive stuff? The Gephi graphs and the outlets.
So how am I presenting?
Yeah.
So in an ideal world, I would love it to be dynamic because the actual data that I put into Gephi is done on a day-by-day basis, so I can have a dynamic graph of it, firing off. Realistically, that's quite difficult to export and to publish. So what I usually end up doing is having a series of static graphs, which presents its own problems because for those of you who don't use Gephi or social networking tools, it expands and structures the actual network based on a series of rules, and that series of rules changes every time you change the data. So that was sort of misleading, those two images. They really shouldn't have been identical points, but for the sake of simplicity and visualization, I kept, this particular newspaper in this corner, and this particular newspaper in this corner. So I like digital media. I think you can be much more expressive with dynamic and especially linkable data. What I would love to do for my articles, and what I tried to do with GitHub, is to create mini databases where every newspaper that I refer to, I can link back to the XML version of it so people can go, that's an interesting interpretation, now let's go look and see if she's got it right. And that's hopefully what will happen.
Thank you, it's very engaging, and I don't come from this historical or digital background at all, so it's, but it engaging in a number of ways. So I was interested particularly in, I wonder if you could go back to the slide that was the software on how you pick up the different tone and feelings in pieces, so the pie charts.
Sure.
Just say something more about that.
So let's go on down here. There we go. Shift F5, not Control F5. Oh no.
I got it, it's all right.
Okay. So
Oh, no. You are right.
we'll go back. Anyways, so what did you want to know about the
I was
graphs?
just interested to know a little bit more about the software, what it actually
Oh,
did.
okay.
Yeah.
So basically what it does is it does a word count of everything that you input into it. So how many times does it use the word savage, for example? And then it has a table of what the word savage falls under. So savage would feel under upset, or savage would feel under happy, probably not, but that sort of thing. So it's basically categorizing the words that you have into 7 different emotional categories, and I think about 10 different topic categories, and then just creating a quantitative pie graph based on that. It's a very blunt instrument, I will admit, but as I said, that blunt instrument made me stop and say, that's a bit strange. The other example I give is I use this in teaching quite a lot, and because it uses modern conceptions of what words mean in terms of emotions, it can have some really weird results when you use historical documents. My students were studying the Alamo, the battle in the Texas independence movement, and they had one art, most of them came up of sudden death because everyone died at the Alamo, but one came up happy and excited, and it's because it kept using the words party for a raiding party, but it misunderstood. So it did give an interesting perspective, and what it basically allowed me to do is say, why did it do that? And then they said, oh, it's using the word party. I said, do we normally use the word party in that way? No, I hadn't really thought about it, and it gave them a new way to search for relevant articles, and it just opened up possibilities.
Can you supply your own sentiment tables to deal with that change of meaning?
Not in this particular user-friendly version. If you actually download the Regressive Imagery Dictionary, you can supply your own tables, yeah. And you can, there's a lot of Python and RScript sentiment analysis tools where you can input your own tables.
Right, sorry. Another question about one of the slides you showed, which was the dendrogram of the
yes.
change of the stories. I wondered whether you had a feeling for this sort of thing, how much of that's real, and how much is a story that diverts because of differential OCR on a reprinted story? That it looks different, but it's actually noise in the data.
Okay, so I did not clarify that in my talk, and that's a good point. When I do the small scale analyses, these are hand transcriptions.
Okay.
So that's why the punctuation is so important. And little things like there was a word in the original version they used islanders, cannibals, natives, Marquesians, and then after about 2 reprints, everything was natives. And that sort of change was really interesting to me. So, but yeah, I tried to do this with the OCR text, but it was so noisy that it didn't really work.
That must have been
Yeah.
Can I ask you about how this fits with the literature in your field? And do you find it difficult? Because, I mean, what we teach undergraduates anyway is that there's no such thing as a new idea. You have to find the 3 people that thought with different perspectives on this question and then tell us which one you thought was right. Are you finding you've got new questions here, or does this slot in with the historiography, as we call it, the literature, previous existing literature in history?
I think it's interesting that there's not a whole lot on the reprint culture from the historical point of view. From the literature point of view, reprint culture is wrapped up with debates about copyright and about authors' rights and genre and pastiches in literature and all that. When it comes to newspapers, it's decided to move on its own. It's decided basically that there is scissors and paste journalism. It happens, people joke about it, and yeah, that's the literature on reprint culture.
So how do you fit that though when you're writing up your article and you have to say this is the landscape, the historical landscape, before you just say, well, nobody really did this before, so I'm going to do it?
What I do tend to do when I'm writing about it is I'm trying to figure out the implications. So if I find there's a really strong link between the Morning Chronicle and the Caledonian Mercury, I talk about the fact that they're both Whig newspapers. And the editors had these sort of backgrounds, and that is something that's really discussed in the literature. So I'm hooking on to sort of the whys and wherefores as opposed to the mechanics that I'm trying to describe.
Actually, following on from that, it's really interesting because what you seem to be implying is actually the format and scale, dare I say, of your publication is intimately linked to the kind of data you're using, the kind of the lens through which you're particularly doing a set of data. I wonder, actually, my question is, are you finding print production, print outputs that's the right format for your research?
I find it very difficult, to be perfectly honest. When I do write, I wrote another article recently that'll be coming out about how women are represented and how that representation gets reprinted. But again, that's a much more traditional straight history approach. When I'm doing this sort of work, non-traditional publications have so far tended to be more useful for me. I hope that will not be the case in the future. I hope that I will find a way to make this more accessible in traditional journal formats. But part of that is the question that Adam was asking, which is if my entire article is, discussing my database that I created and referencing my own database, it doesn't fit as neatly into the idea of what a secondary source should be to talking about the rest of the literature. It feels very much like, look at my database, isn't it neat?
But this is, sorry to
Yeah, no.
Because on the one hand, it's making your data available, say, through GitHub.
Yeah.
But then there's another implication that you want to write an article or a book or something in between, which moves dynamically between a kind of argument, political argument, and the data. And have you found a format to do that for you yet?
Yeah, so I think what Tim Hitchcock here was trying to do with his London Lives book is the sort of model that I'm hoping to follow, maybe in a slightly more dynamic format than he was eventually able to do. But the idea of having it hyperlinked, to having people be able to look at what I'm saying and then sort of tear apart the data and see how it fits to my interpretation. And that would be an e-format. It just couldn't be a print book without being this long.
So, I had a question.
Yes.
Which is a sort of question. So, as far as I can tell, what you were kind of arguing, quote unquote, is that we may assume that computational technologies applied to humanities problems do so at a level of big scale, but that there are many approaches, tools, whatever you want to call it, that enable us to work at various levels, various registers, various proximities to the stuff that we care about, which is somewhere at the bottom compared to big data, whatever it's on. And I think you also kind of subtly suggested that using those tools with data enables us to reflect in a way kind of where we are in that process. So if scholars in humanities are not that, you said something in Q&A at the end, I can't remember exactly what you said. You said something about sort of working with these tools, helping us sort of really understand the assumptions and the methods that we use when otherwise we might just read some stuff and write something. And that you actually would like sometimes people to explain it in those terms, almost computationally, in order to help you understand better their interpretation. So you're almost kind of suggesting that using these tools actually helps us understand where we are in those registers. It helps actually understand sometimes where we are close, where we are far away. Because I guess sometimes you can be far away from one thing, but you're quite close to another. That wasn't really my question. With apologies. It's kind of the setup, which is that you didn't talk much about this middle ground. So you kind of suggested this middle ground thing has a bad reputation. I've never really thought of that before. What it did make me think of is the amount of times we, I guess you suggest this as well, that we are working in humanities quite close to things, and that we fudge a sense of distance through either talking somewhere in an introduction about how it's some wider historiography, or somewhere else about more work that needs to be done connected to why, and that we don't really work either at medium or large scale in most cases. And that medium scale sometimes, perhaps the easiest way to think of the medium scale is almost non-academic history writing. We get the great syntheses which are clearly working at large scale, we get the sort of the working at case study level that isn't a case study because we can't call it a case study anymore. But we don't really do that middle, and that's coming somewhere out of the popular literature. I guess, I'm wondering to what extent you are then working at the medium scale, because you talked not a lot about that. And yet it seems the most interesting one where there can be a kind of proper intellectual intersection through these tools, actually negotiating ourselves in that middle ground which we don't tend to work in, actually thinking thoroughly whilst we're doing it, what it is we're doing, what it is we're achieving, by not being too close to our information, by being not just talking about it in a grand scale, but actually working some middle which we don't want to do.
I mean, you're absolutely right there. When I was putting together this presentation, my middle scale slides felt a little bit smaller than my other two, and I completely realized that. And it's because it's hard to work at the middle scale. And I recognize that I do it, but as I was saying before, it's like a sine wave. So you kind of start at the large scale, and you're thinking about it for a while, and you kind of move through the middle scale, and then you're at the small scale for a while, and you move through the middle scale, going back up and down. And I like the middle scale, and I've only really just started working at it. The idea of taking the heuristics and your intimate knowledge of how case studies works and trying to apply that to the big data sets. And that's what the middle scale is for me. It's trying to take the small scale methodologies and using it on big data, as opposed to using large scale methodologies where you allow for noise and fuzziness and all that. And it's more difficult than either of the other two, but I think it can come up with some really interesting answers if we experiment more on it. So it's sort of a challenge.
So my follow-up to that is because one of the things you said was that in your instance, the network graph is useful, but the network graph doesn't tell us how the thing the network is about works,
yes.
Right? And you could easily apply that to any other big scale thing. I guess we normally stick theory then, right? When we're thinking about something at a big scale, we're trying to figure out how it works. We stick some theory in the middle that kind of helps us with that bit, and then we talk about the stuff at the bottom somewhere. And this isn't theory. I guess that's what's really interesting, is like how it's made me really think about that sort of middly ground and where that functions in terms of our method as scholars, historians, scholars more broadly. Again, it's not really a question.
No, I think, but it does raise a real point. I remember I was teaching on a cross-disciplinary dissertation preparation module, and they had a lecture series on theory. And all the politics and IR students went to the lecture on theory, and none of the historians did. because there's this idea that historians don't use theory. We use schools and fields and approaches, but it's not theory in the same way that IR theory is theory. And I thought that was a real shame, and I think you're absolutely right. The medium scale, it's a way of developing theories. It's a way of sort of testing things out from our coincidences and our correlations and seeing where they fit. And I would find it very uncomfortable to publish an article about my middle ground research because of the reasons you said, where we normally publish the top or the bottom. But I'm trying to break out of that uncomfortable feeling, because this graph that I have about the directed one was the most interesting one that I thought of in a long time, because I knew about the connection between the Morning Chronicle and the Caledonian Mercury. But the connections to some of the other newspapers, so for example, like the Derby Mercury and the Oxford Journal, when you looked at the other graph, they are bound up with each other. They always have the same shared information. But when you look at the directed graph, they're not connected at all. It's always going through intermediaries. And I thought that juxtaposition was really interesting and worthy of study itself. And it's not something I would have got at the small scale, and it's not something I got at the large scale. It was an entirely different point that was coming out because I had kind of straddled in between. So I think the middle ground is uncomfortable but fruitful. Does that sort of address? Yeah.
Is your big scale, your large scale, going to become your middle scale when you have more data to put into it?
Oh yes, absolutely. So currently I'm working with some others to sort of make it transnational, so to take the Library of Congress newspapers and Trove's Australian newspapers and some of the Dutch and German newspapers and put them all together and see what happens. And yes, then the British Library will become the medium scale, but I don't think in terms of methodology. I think the methodology that I'm using at my large scale will be the same rough methodology I'm using when it's mega large scale. And I think the medium scale that I'm talking about here is something distinct in terms of methodology. I think there's a lower limit to large scale, but the upper limit isn't. It can be quite wide.
So flipping Adam's question around, can a whole load of work, billions of words on page actually be far away? In the sense of, by small scale here you mean like actually reading stuff, but actually compared to the actual experience of an individual or experience of a group of people, actually most of those words are kind of out, they would have been read, looked at, whatever. It's actually on some levels it's not close in a way. So on some levels actually, depending on where your lens is, it's actually far away from experience, right?
The experience of the newspaper reader.
Well, the experience of somebody who's not a newspaper reader. So newspapers are part of culture, right?
Yeah.
Someone may not read many newspapers, make application across them. That doesn't mean that the newspaper page always has to be that kind of sort of close scale. That isn't always the point of some close reading. It can be far away from something else.
Yeah.
So I guess just tying what Adam said, is that kind of, I'm interested in that disentangling of the method of thinking of scales and the actual what it is that is the scale, not just more on top, but sometimes depending where we are within what we're interested in. Some things actually aren't necessarily close necessarily. We may assume close reading is reading some parts of text in the correct order, but that could not actually be close. In a funny way.
Yes, I think I understand what you mean. Yeah, I think, I mean, in the end, all of these terms are sort of ambiguous depending on how we're approaching them. And the way I did it with my silly Van Wyck paintings was how it worked within the concept of my research. And sort of to go back to Adam's comment, this is my middle ground, my middle version of my methodology. And if you're doing an entirely different type of digital humanities research, you're going to have very different scales and different things that you consider close or far away. But I think the thing I was really hoping was that you should look at it from as many different scales as possible, however those scales are defined to you.
I just wanted to just say, because I think this is what you're saying, right? That like.
I'll take it back.
Well, no, I don't know what you're saying. I do know what you're saying. Okay. You're using the word far away, and you're using big data, but in like but distant, right? I mean, distant reading and close reading is attached to like study of literature in like the humanities departments, where you go in and you read, I don't know, whatever, like, I can't think of a single book. Ulysses, like by going like in minutely reading all the details of the sentence and blah blah blah, and that's like what we used to do fine. And then there's distant reading, which like Melodee and everybody with like data and patterns and trends and computing and fine and good, and we get trends, and that's a completely different methodology that has completely different value, and they're both really useful ways of approaching texts. But like, and I know this is what you're saying anyway, so I'm sorry to reiterate, but it's kind of really interesting to think, if that's distant and that's close, then what's middle reading? I know that's what you've been saying, but what is middle reading? And if we're saying that distant reading is a methodology, which it is, that produces a certain level of set of results, and close reading is its own discrete methodology that produces a certain set of results, then what is middle reading?
Because what is it we can model it
What's its
through in real
method?
life?
Huh?
What is it we can model it through in real life? Is it skim reading?
Like surface reading is a method, right, that as opposed to depth reading. So there's that. I'm just trying to, yeah, it's not a question and it's not an answer. But I just thought it was interesting.
It is
you know, that,
definitely an interesting point. I think,
well, you just take sort of a medium amount of data, whereas with a close reading you might take a sentence. But it's not the amount of data you take really, isn't it? It's an approach. So it's just, I don't know the answer, it's just...
When you said rules, that was an interesting turn of phrase, I thought. We used the word heuristics, but
yeah, rules, yes.
was
You have to say heuristics.
was
if
a
you're digital
sense of refining and limiting and giving direction. Okay, it's direction quite literally in this sense, but
Yeah.
it is interesting to me. And this is a really interesting question because I was trying to phrase it as a tweet. And what did I say? I said something about, okay, refining big data, applying rules to create meaning, because it seemed that you were suggesting that the kind of the Giphy graphs were suggestive, but only on a kind of beginning.
Yeah, they gave me some idea of some aspects of the network, but not necessarily the one I wanted most.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point really to heart, because I think it's interesting in terms of terminology. With close reading, I mean, are my dendrograms, is that close reading? I mean, I've looked at every single word very carefully as I put it down that Excel sheet, but it's not close reading in terms of that defined methodology. So my idea of close reading is looking at the punctuation and the word order and things like that. And my idea of distant reading is matching general phrases together. So I think it is a sense of maybe my misapplying those terms, but I think that's good. In a way, I think that we have to define our own middle ground based on what I hope was the idea of applying what we've learned. So the only reason I knew about 200 days, and this many words of character matching on left and right and overall is because I had read so many newspaper articles. And I noticed that, 200 days really was the cutoff. And it was very strange because there were quite a lot of 199 days and not very many 201 days. It actually broke down quite well. So that's what my middle ground was, is using the things I've learned from my small scale and trying to apply it to my big scale. And I would love to know what the middle ground is for the actual methodologies of close and distant reading, because it's a really interesting question in terms of, is it skim reading?
I think coming back to that, so I feel like with the distant reading, you talk about, not you, but because I'm coming from a literature background, so I don't have history stuff, so sorry, but with the distant reading, people talk about findings, right? You're like, I found this trend, right? And with close reading, even though there's obviously like a set of rules to it, it's always sort of intuitive ultimately. But like, I mean, not maybe it's for everything with like the new critics or whatever, but like when I'm in a classroom, I'm like, well, we use this word here right before a comma. Essentially what I'm saying is like, how does that make you feel? Like, how does that sentence now function to produce a certain meaning for the reader? It's always going to be, someone will disagree, and we can argue forever, and we can like turn it around, and I think that's really valuable work. But I think that there is something where distant reading can be talked about in terms of findings, because you're looking at data. Again, I don't want to be in these binary thoughts, but I think middle reading might be this really interesting concept, which sort of is falling in between like findings and intuitions and data as literature and literature as data. And that's, again, I'm just throwing.
No,
this
it's
out there,
really
but
interesting way.
it
Thank you.
pulls together, and again, it pulls it to an amorphous nothingness that I don't have any dimensions to. But I think that's a really interesting space to think about in terms of scale and also like digital.
But I wonder, sorry, John.
No,
I was going to talk, yeah, okay. Because I wonder whether just setting up closer disagreeing binaries is just not the way to go in the first place.
I'm not trying to.
No, I
Yeah,
was saying,
it's like the real estate.
the thing that happens, because you were talking about this kind of sine wave and a kind of constant movement, except too, when he was talking about the linguistic DNA project in Igbo, it seemed to imply again that there was a kind of movement between top-down intuitive categories and a kind of bottom-up working from data, and that there was a constant negotiation between those two things, and whether you conceive of that as a constant movement or whether there's a stopping point on the way.
Research is never completed, only abandoned.
I don't know.
This sort of follows on. You're actually using two different scales. One is distance and one is size. And elephants far away are very small. But bugs through a microscope are enormous.
Yes.
This gets away from the binary. Would you like to comment on this? Because I've run out of things to say about this.
Just briefly, yeah. One of the things about scales is that my scale for, how many pieces of data I put, how many articles I put into my box is one way I've scaled it big to small. The other one is how closely I look. Do I look at when I'm looking at lots and lots of data, I would love to do the dendrograms. I would love to do that punctuation analysis. But because my data is OCR'd, I can't. So my scale at that is quantitative, whereas I would like to be able to do it with the microscope. So I don't know if that really kind of addresses it. It's multi-scale are not three separate things. And I think that redefining those in terms of quantitative versus detail versus geography, however you want to define scale, I think those can also be different. You can do large-scale analysis in lots of different ways on the same set of data. And I think that would be just as interesting in multi-scale as doing it sort of vertically, the way I've described it here. Does that make sense?
Julie's waving out.
You talked about using the small scale, going back to the middle ground thing then, small scale to inform maybe heuristics to do the large scale analysis. Do you find that it also works the other way around, that the large scale is directing the small scale, and that you can use kind of large scale analysis that you're doing to kind of inform your kind of smaller scale kind of?
It certainly helps me find case studies. My cannibals, when I first started, I had 3 copies of it. And when I did the large-scale analysis, I found 3 more copies of it. And then when I hand transcribed those, instead of using the OCR, I found 3 more copies of it in my database. So I think they inform back and forth really, really nicely. And also, when I wrote my first article on my cannibals, which still hasn't come out and it still kind of frustrates me because I've changed all my opinions now, I had this very clear idea of how the relationship between the Morning Chronicle and the Caledonian Mercury worked. And when I saw it at the large scale, I realized I was misinterpreting that relationship based on the assumptions I had made when I was looking at the small scale. And when I looked at it in the context of the big scale analysis, I realized that I'd been looking at it sort of sideways, and that actually I could have interpreted it in a different way, and I would have got something that was closer to my large scale analysis. So I guess it's like looking at a brook from one side or the other. You suddenly realize, oh, I'm standing at the wrong angle. Now I can see how it works. So it definitely does inform the other way.
I think we should perhaps draw this. I think we've sort of coined something. Slightly by accident, you do what you do. Yeah, we now need to figure out what that means. Next day, sorry. But before we do, we of course need to thank Melodee. Before we do that, I just want to remind some people who have already signed up to who've already said they want to come to dinner with us. A bunch of us are having dinner in town. Joe.
It's Beals.
Loughborough. There you go.
If you're wondering where to go, ask me.
Yeah. And if some people want to join us, then they can.
And the last thing I would say is if you do want to play with my data and do strange things with it, I have little cards here that will show you where to get to it. So please do take one.
On which note, I think you can take that.